Hi everybody, I'm Carl and today I will be making this Weirwood tree model for the Song of Ice and Fire tabletop game, out of junk mail. The techniques I will be using are based on a jungle tree tutorial by Platypus Scotsman, and I recommend a visit to his channel when you're done with this video. There's a link in the description below. To begin with, let's make some modeling compound. This is loosely based on a similar compound which Luke from Luke's APS made, again link in the description, with some changes of my own. The end result isn't as smooth as commercial sculpted mold or Luke's version, but it's good enough for this project. So, gather up your junk mail, waste paper and incriminating documents, and rip them up. Put them in a bucket and cover them over with water. Leave them to sit for a few days, giving them a stir every few hours. This takes longer than Luke's process, but since most of the time you don't need to do anything, it should take less of your time. After a few days, squeeze the paper into little balls, squeezing out as much water as possible, and leave them somewhere to dry. Don't worry if they're too large, you can always break them down some more later. Again, the drying process is a bit slower than Luke's since you're not using an oven, but you don't need to wash them since there is a very little chance of them catching on fire, unless you leave them somewhere stupid. It didn't take long for this batch to dry, but then again we're in the middle of a heat wave. Once the chunks of paper are completely dry, they're ready for use. I only mix up as much as I plan to use at one time. Mix 1 part paper and 1 part polyfiller or plaster in a sealable container, and give them a good shake. Then add about 3/4 part water and knead it like dough until it turns into a clay-like consistency. Keep your hands wet and get ready to start modeling. I used the dowel with a piece of foil wrapped around it as a base to build over, and at this stage I was just slopping the compound on. After I reached the point where I thought the branches would start, I let it sit for a few minutes and then came back and smoothed it with a little water. When this was completely hardened, I wrapped some twisted steel wire around the dowel, built up the trunk some more, and then added some knobs to create a starting point for the larger branches, which I would complete once this was fuel cured. In the meantime, I started to add roots to the trunk by rolling out sausages of compound and blending them into the tree. I was trying to have the roots spread out as far as possible, because I didn't plan to add a separate base for this model, so it could be used on different types of terrain. Otherwise, if I made a grassland base, it would look very silly on snow and vice versa. At the same time, I didn't want to make it too large because the tree has an in-game proximity effect, so making the footprint too large would make it influence a disproportionate area. I tried to keep it more or less within the footprint of the cardboard tree from the box set. Once the first set of branches and roots were cured and hardened, I repeated with the next set of major branches and more roots. To build up the smaller branches, I just attached some piece of twisted wire to the larger branches and the trunk using the compound. Once it dries, it's rock solid. I didn't fuss about smoothing the branches as much as I did with the trunk because I was planning to cover most of them with foliage, so they would be hidden. With the structure of the tree done, I started to add some texture using a wire brush. This was suggested to me by both Giacomo Pantalone of the Lazy Forger and the Platypus Scotsman himself. And although I had already planned to do this, it's always nice to have confirmation from someone more experienced, so thank you gentlemen. I do think they had a smaller wire brush in mind though. After the spot of texturing, I dusted the tree and removed some of the foil from the base. Then it was time to add the face, but before we move on to that, if you are enjoying this video, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing to this channel. I was dreading the next step. I hadn't sculpted anything in years, so I was a bit worried, and tried to keep the face as stylized as possible to make things a bit easier. I laid out the tree on an old towel so I could work on it horizontally without damaging it. I started by dampening the area where the face was going on, built a rough skull shape, and then bugged out the eyes, lips and nose. At this stage the camera's face recognition started to kick in, which is always a good sign. Speaking of which, the camera was helpful here for once because I could see the scalp from 2 angles at a time. Once the first pass was done, I added some grooves by way of texture, and left it to set for a bit. After that, I meant to refine the eyes and nose a little, but I ended up rebuilding most of the face and adding a whole lot of texture. Finally, I spread out some steel wool coloring pads along the branches and pinned them in place with super glue, like I did in the plastic tree video. This simulates smaller branches and gives you plenty of surface area to glue the foliage later. I went a bit over the top here, but I like floofy trees. Once that is in place, the tree is ready for painting. I primed everything in black and then went over it again in grey. When spraying grey, I intentionally kept the spray on the steel wool lighter so it wouldn't go as deep. This leaves the deeper strands darker. Weirwoods are described as having a white bark, which I chose to interpret as being a very light brownish grey rather than pure snow white. My choice is mostly based on my difficulty painting white, as it tends to end up looking bluish or greyish instead. I was hoping that going for a very light brown would allow me to create some more interesting shadows. And here are the colors I picked for this one. Burnt sienna and ivory will be used for the trunk, and titanium white for the extreme highlights. Burnt umber and emerald for the deep shading, and scarlet for detail. Both emerald and scarlet have a name on them, but I'm not going to try to pronounce them in case I summon Cthulhu by accident. The first layer was a very thin wash of burnt umber with a hint of green. This was splashed on all over the trunk, and what I was aiming for was to get into all the crevices and shaded areas. After that, I started to dry brush with a mix of burnt umber and burnt sienna. Then burnt sienna and ivory. At this stage I decided it was way too dark, so I went back and gave everything a heavy dry brush with burnt sienna, and started adding ivory to the mix and making progressively lighter passes. Finally, I gave everything a very light dry brush of titanium white. Once I was happy with the effect, I gave the whole tree a quick clear coat with a sealer. This has two purposes. It helps make the steel wool more solid, and it protects the paint. The steps after this add a whole lot of water, and I didn't want that to wash away the thin layers of paint. I also coated the bottom of the tree, as this would add a little long-term protection where it touches the table. Once the clear coat was dry, I mixed the scarlet wash with a tiny droplet of window cleaner to make it flow better. I also added a droplet of water to each corner of the ice on the face to draw out the paint and make it flow. Then I painted the wash into the ice to represent the Weirwood sap. You might want to use multiple layers here since the wash can be very thin. I taped the model into a plastic bag to avoid getting flock into all sorts of inconvenient places, and sprayed the steel with a mixture of watered down PVA glue and a drop of washing up liquid. Then I dunked the flock all over it and repeated till I had a few layers. I let it dry overnight, then repeated as the flock hadn't taken very well on one side and it still looked a bit bare. The second pass sorted it out. The flock wasn't exactly the color I wanted, but I made 3 different attempts to get it blood red and it failed every time, so I decided to stick it on, see how it looks, and paint over it again if necessary. Luckily for me, once it dried, it wasn't as glaringly pink as it looked in the tray, so I was happy to call the job done. A couple of layers of sealer on the flock fixed it in place. And there you have it. I am really happy with the way it turned out, and I find the idea that most of this started off as junk mail very pleasing for some reason. Before I sign off, I'd like to thank Platypus Scotsman for his tutorial again, and I hope you enjoyed this video. If you make something of your own using these techniques, do feel free to poke me on Facebook or Instagram. I'd love to see what you come up with. Thank you for watching, and until next time.